the simplest CRUD application I have ever implemented and very fast. Right? Hi everyone, hope that you all are doing well. In my last video where we discussed what is GraphQL and how you can integrate with Springboot app, the link would be in the I button and in the description. Do click and watch. Hey developers, welcome to Code with Raman, your backend dev hub. Wanna master reactive programming with real world projects? Check out my reactive playlist. Need a real project for your resume or portfolio? We have got a complete bus reservation system. Curious about how AI can turbocharge your Spring apps? Dive into my Spring AI playlist. It's all practical, production ready, and beginner friendly. So if you are into Java, Spring Boot, and powerful backend tools, like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell icon. Let's build something awesome together. Today, let us design a Spring Boot app and perform CRUD operations with GraphQL. So I'm on my IDE. Let's jump to write the code. So let's create a new project first. So let me go new and let me say Spring Starter project. Let me select a Spring Starter project. Let me name the project as Spring Boot GraphQL. Right, Spring Boot GraphQL CRUD. And the Java version is 21 and the packages are com.code with raman.implementation. So let's go next and add dependency. So we'll be creating a GraphQL application, the CRUD operations. So we also need a database. So I'll be using MySQL database in this application. So let me select MySQL first. I need a Spring Web dependency to interact with the APIs, right? And then we'll be interacting with the database in the JPA way. So let me add the JPA dependency as well. And then we need a GraphQL dependency. So let me add GraphQL web dependency. So let's finish and let's import the project. So my project is ready and imported. So the structure of the project is similar to what we create every time a Spring Boot app. Just that for GraphQL, there would be a folder of GraphQL where you can add the schema. So let's get started. Let's simply create a class that will be our entity class. So let me name it as book and let me also define the package for it. So let's say model package and book class. So we'll be interacting with the database. So I need to create it a entity which can have a table. So we need to have a table of book into our database. So let me first define it as entity. So let me define it as entity and let me also define the table, right? And in table let me say name equal and let me say book. So our table will have name as book and we first need a key, private key. So let's say private and let me define it as a long. So let me define the primary key. So let's define private long id, right? And to this let me mark this as unique. So let me say id, right? And generated value strategy equals generation type dot identity, right? So my primary key is defined. So let me now define private string. So we'll have the title for our book. So we need title, then we need the author, right? The author of the book, and we need the published year. So let me define integer published, right? Published year, right? So these are the fields that would be present in my database, right? So this is my entity. Let me define the getters and setters for the. So let me say source and generate getters and setters. Let me select all, right? So my entity class is ready. Right? It has getters and setters, and we have few fields. One is our primary key ID, and then we have title, author, and published year. Now let's define the repository of this class. So let me simply say a new class, and I'll name it as book. Let me name it as book repository, and let me define the package also as repository. So my book repository, and I don't need a class. I will be requiring an interface, so I'll change it at that moment, no problem. I'm on my book interface, so let me define this as an interface rather than a class. So let me define this as an interface rather than let me extend with JPA repository, and here we'll be defining a book class that we have already defined in our package, and we have the ID as long, so we'll have the long ID. So this is my interface ready. So this is my interface. This is my book repository. So now what we have to do, basically book repository is interacting with the database, right? So we don't need to define any methods because we have predefined methods of JPA repository that we'll be using. So now I need to define a service for my book. So let me say a new class and I'll name it as book service, and I'll also define the package as service. Let me finish, and so my book service is ready. So what do you have to do? we have to first define it as a service. So let me mark this as an annotation. Now I need book repository. So I need to inject book repository into this class. I'll do the constructor injection of this. So let me do source and let me say generate constructor using field. Right. So I've done the constructor injection. So what all methods could be there in a CRUD operation? So first, let's make a method as and we'll be returning a list of book, and let's say find all, and find all will basically we'll return all the books, right? Using book repository, we'll say find all and we'll return this, right? So find all basically is finding all the data and returning it to the user. Or rather, let me define this method as get all book, get all, a more clear representation. Now let me define a method which will be returning which will be basically returning a not optional of GraphQL. I don't need a optional of GraphQL. I need of Java. I need of util, and we will be saying optional of book, and we'll say find by ID, get book by ID, right? Get book by ID. So you might be thinking that this is familiar to the previous example. Yes, it is familiar. We are basically implementing a book example only, but there will be other methods also. So in the previous example, we just worked on get book by ID and get all book. But today we'll be updating the record, we'll be deleting the record, we'll be fetching all the data, and all those things would be happening. So we'll be writing, basically this is called as we are changing the data. So we'll be writing mutation queries as well. So we need a ID here. So let me say long ID, and we'll be returning book repository dot get by ID, and we'll pass the ID. Or we'll say or get by ID. So we'll be returning book repository dot get by ID. Okay, not get by ID because this is a deprecated method. So we'll say find by ID. Right. So this will return as an option. So we are on the same page of the previous video. We have defined methods, but we were returning the data directly from the service class. We were having some hard-coded data which we were returning for the call. But in this example, we'll be returning data from the database. So now we also need to add some data to the database. Then only we'll be returning the data. So let me define a method to add some data. So we'll be returning a book object here, and we'll say add book, and we are expecting an input of book. So let's say book, and we'll say return book repository dot save, and we'll be passing the book object here. So our add method is also ready. So we'll be passing the book object from our GraphQL input, and then we'll be saving that data to our database. So now we have saved the data, we have found the data by ID, and we have found all the data. Now we have to delete the data. Oh, sorry, we have to update the data. So how we can do that? So let's define a method to update the data. So let's say public book. We'll be returning a book object only. We'll say update book, right? And in update book, we haven't defined any constructor. So let's say ID would be passed, title would be passed, and string author will be input, and integer year will be an input. So what we'll do here, we'll simply say, let me say return book repository dot say book repository dot find by ID. We have the ID. We'll say find by ID dot map, and will be map B, and will be like B. And what we can do here is we will say we are creating a reference of B. So let me, and we'll say B dot set author. We'll say author. B dot set title will be title, and B dot set published year. It will be published year, and then we'll be saving the data. So we'll say book repository dot save, and we'll pass. And if this is not there, so what we'll do, if the record is not there, so let me push this back for, or else we'll return null. So basically what we are saying, if there is a data present in the database with this particular ID that is coming as an input, we have to get that data, and we have to update the data with data that is coming as an input, the title, author, and published year. If these are different from what is present in the database, we have to update it, and then we have to save it for this particular ID only, right? And if the data is not present with that ID, then we have to simply return a null. So we can't save that data. So we have now updated the data as well. So now let me define another method that will be basically returning that will be basically a delete of the, right? So let's say it will be returning a boolean delete. We'll say delete book, and we will be having a long ID as an input. So what we'll do, we'll simply check if the data exists in the repository. So what we'll say, book repository exists by ID. We'll be passing the ID here, and if it exists, what we have to do, we have to simply say book repository dot delete by, sorry, I've taken the object, book repository dot delete by ID, and we have the ID here. We'll say return true. If it doesn't go in the if condition, we'll return a false. So our delete is also done. So in the delete, what we are doing, if the data if the data is present with that ID in the database, we'll be deleting it and returning a true. Otherwise, if the data doesn't exist, we'll return a false. So our service class is ready now. Now what we have to do, we have to call these methods from our controller class. So our controller class again is a resolver. In GraphQL terms, we say it as a resolver. So let me create another class and let me say new class. I'll name it as book resolver, and my package would be of a controller. Let me finish and import the class. First, let me mark this as a controller. Now we'll be interacting with the service. So let me define it as a let me inject the service first. So let me do the constructor injection. Let me say constructor using field is selected. So we have done the constructor injection. Now what? Now we have to define method. If you go back to the previous video, we have already defined query mappings, right? Query mappings for getting the data, for fetching all the data by fetching by ID, right? Same way, we'll be defining it for those two methods, but for other, we'll be defining mutation mapping, right? So let's get started. So let me say query mapping, and in the query mapping, let's define a method. We'll say public list of book, right? First import the list, and we'll define the method as all, which we did in the previous example as well, and we'll simply say return book service, get all books. So our method will be called. Now another query mapping that we have to define, query mapping, and we'll say public, we need a book, so we'll say book, and we'll say book by ID, right? And we need to define an argument that will be coming in this method. That will be a long ID. So now what we have to do, we'll say simply return book service. What method we defined? So we defined get book by ID. So we'll pass the ID. So it is returning an optional. So we'll say or else we will return a null. If we get the object, great. If we don't, we'll return a null. So our two methods of query mapping are defined. Right. Same way, now we have to define a mutation mapping for update. So let's say mutation mapping, right? Mutation mapping, and we'll say public. We need to update the data, and we'll be returning a simple single object. So we'll be returning a book object. So we need to first define add book method, and in this we will be getting some arguments. So the arguments will be string title would be there, and we need another argument that will be, what is happening here? Okay. So let me define it as like this, string argument, and we will be defining it as author, and another argument that we'll be getting integer here. So how we'll be returning this? So we'll say return book service dot add book. Now add book requires a book object, so we'll say new book. Okay, it doesn't have the constructor, so let me go to the book class first, and let me do enter, and let me define a method first with the fields. I'll remove the ID, and let me remove the ID, and let's generate it. Now I'll be having a constructor here. So let's say book. Yes, so we have a constructor, we have title, author, published here. So this will create an object of book, and that will be passed as a input to add book method. Now this add book method, if we go, we are basically using the repository to save the data. So let me save the argument first, and let me also save it here. So now my add book is ready, right? So now we have to define another mutation mapping, right? Another mutation mapping that will be basically updating the data. So let's say public, and it also returns a book object. So we'll say update book, and in this we will be having argument. So let's say argument, and it will be a long ID, then argument, another argument will be string title, or let me rather copy it from the above method. Let me copy this, right? So we'll be having all these things. So now now what we have to do, we have to again say return book service dot, we need to update it, and we have all the data. So let's simply call the update method. Now it is basically taking all the data, and it is basically setting a new, updating the existing data into the database if present, and then returning a book object to us. So we have another mutation query of updation. We are ready with that. Now another mutation query will be of delete. So let's say mutation mapping, and we'll say public. We need to define a book. We'll say delete book, and in the delete book we need an argument of ID. So we'll say long ID, and simply we'll be returning it from book service. So we'll say book service dot delete book by ID, and we are passing the ID. So, oh sorry, I find it wrong. We are returning a boolean, so it will be a boolean. So a boolean will get returned here. So now my resolver is also ready. One thing that we have to do extra in GraphQL is to map the queries with the mapping that we have defined, right? So we will be basically defining a schema. So let's go to GraphQL folder, and let's say new create a file, and we'll name it as schema.graphqls, right? So let me add this file, and we have to define some schema here. So let me bring the same from the previous code. We have defined the schema of the book table, right? Where we have the ID, we have title as string, we have author as string, we have published year as in. Let me do a comma here because, right? So now you can see that we have defined a schema for book where we have ID, title, author, and published year in the table. Then we have type queries. Type queries are basically the queries which we have defined as query mapping, all books and book by ID, right? So these are all book and book by ID, right? So now what we have to do, we have mutation queries as well. So we'll define mutation queries, right? So these are type queries. So we'll define the type as mutation, and we have add book. Add book has author, published year, and author, right? Author, published year, and title as an input, and it will be returning a book object. Then same way we have update book, which has the input as ID and author and published year. So it will also return a book object. And then we have delete book, right? So it is also getting the input as an argument as an ID, and it will be returning a boolean. So these method names, basically add book, update book, and delete book, are basically mapping here, right? Add book, update book, and delete book. So basically we'll be calling that method from the GraphQL interface, and it will be interacting with our this particular endpoints of our controller. So we need to define few properties in our application.properties to interact with the database, and also enable the GraphQL UI to basically hit our queries to this particular. So we have our schema ready. We have our properties ready. Let me define the schema in our MySQL workbench. So we have any table with this name? Yes, we have. So let's say set as default, right? So now my schema is also ready, and my code is also ready. So let's go and let's run the application. So let me run the application. So you can see our application has started, right? Our application has started, and you can see the table is also created in the database. And also the GraphQL mapping is also done, right? So let me go to the database and let me refresh it if we have the table. So yes, we have the table. The books table is ready. So now what we can do, we can simply go to our GraphQL UI, and let me define this. I need to go to the URL 8080 GraphQL IQL, and it will open a interface, and let's run few queries here. So this is a mutation query to add the data. We are basically saying the title is GraphQL in action, the author is Sam developer, and the published year is 2025, right? And we are saying that this is a mutation query, so please add the data, right? Add the data to the database and return the ID, title, and author, right? The output would be ID, title, and author, right? ID, title, and author would be returned, not the published year. So if I say published year as well, so it will return a published year as well. So let me run this query. So it says the data is saved, the ID is 1, the title is this, and author is this. So if I say like, if I go to the database also, and if I run a query here to get all the data from this database, we'll have one entry, right? We have one entry. Now, if I say that I want to get all the data from the database, so let me define a query, a simple query. So let me run this. It will return all the data. So it says internal server error, all book for entity book, no default. Oh, okay. Okay, we are basically not having a default constructor specifically defined. So I need to define a default constructor as well. So let me define a default constructor. That is why it was not able to create an object, right? So let me close it. So our application has started. So let me go again and let me fetch the data again. So hope so, yes. So it returns the data. So it returns the data. We were missing on the default constructor. So now let me run another query to get the data by ID. So let me say ID1. So it has returned me GraphQL and SAM. Now we already have data in our database, and now I can test the updation of the data. Right. So let me define another mutation query that will be saying ID1, and we are basically changing the published year from 2024 to 2025. So let me say run. It has returned me 2025. Now let's go to the database as well and let me refresh this row. So now you can see that published year have the value 2025, right? So this is like the simplest CRUD application I have ever implemented and very fast, right? So now let me do the delete of the data. So let me just simply publish the delete with an ID1. So it will return a true. It will return true, and let's go to the database and you will see no rows present in the data, right? So the data has been deleted. So I guess this is the most fastest and the simplest CRUD application that I have ever implemented it. So this was it. We built a CRUD application from scratch using Springboot and GraphQL. Hope that you might have gained some knowledge on from this video. That how we have implemented GraphQL and Spring Boot together using implementing a CRUD application. If you learned something from this video, please like, share, and comment on the video. And if new to the channel, please subscribe and press the bell icon. Hope to see you in the next video. Till then, happy learning.